Opening credits. Candlelit Dinner with a Cadaver. Series 1, Book 1. Written by A.J. Pitiro. Narrated by R.E. Harter. Introduction. God. A being, a paradox of infinite veracity, a spiteful snake circling into itself, creating false notions of cause and effect in an ever-growing totality of mass and atomic space. It traces close an entropic tale of non-materialistic, abstract knowledge of its own existence. It creates a friction of ripples developing into vibration, forming reality in its own shadow, as it slithers in between existence and non-existence. Those sparks it creates with its scales by its ingenious rubbing pop fragments of life into and out of your universe. It's more of a thought process than a being, says the painter. Tell me again about the day before today, Simon, said His Holiness. All right, but time is relative, Simon rebutted. Don't be so apprehensive, Simon, declared the sun. I am possessed with clarity, reproached the spirit. Okay, but it's pretty grisly and weird, maybe epistemologically not sound, says Simon. The master retorts, Your truth is a lie, Simon. You should know that by now. I'll need a minute to remember all the details, Simon says. The head states, take your time. It's just a measure of correlation. Simon begins. I was hiking with my friends Benny, Patrick, and Paul in a forest near our home. Our friend Lane was running late, but was sure to be there. A little way on, we went up this big hill. Okay, now I remember, Simon. Continue. Finally, says the maker. Chapter 1. Fear. It was late in the middle of the day in our country town. A new moon with a twilight-covered sky, orange and purple. It was a dry, hot summer day, and we all needed something to do. We all desired to take a new trail that we've never seen before, but making sure to leave a note for Lane to find us later. We all thought she was just finishing up her horse-riding lessons with her mother, and she would catch up later. Lane gave us chocolate candy she found at an abandoned campsite earlier. We had some, but we were saving the rest for when she returned. We all noticed the candy must have been delicious because she ate a quarter bag before she gave the rest to us. I thought to myself, but continuing with the story. It took some time to get through the thick bushes at the beginning of the marked trail. We couldn't wait to hang out again. It's been a while, with Paul always working around the house and Lane hanging out with her dad, not to mention Ben's sessions of lone wandering. Continuing forward is when our happy life was stolen from us. We were less than a mile in, and a feeling of unease crept into the surroundings. We saw new plant life we'd never discovered before. It was oddly covering the trail. The feeling of reminiscing and depression was upon us, like the feeling of standing in front of the grave of a loved one. Paul became a little on edge, saying we needed to watch out. There may be a baby bear nearby, as he heard clicking, indicative of it climbing. It would be dangerous to be near a mother bear and her cub. As we started to consider it, it began to rain. A beautiful, light rain with mist appeared in the middle of the woods all of a sudden, almost like a personal rain cloud. It felt like it was only over us. Completely unaware of us, fingers of fog were curling silently under and around leaves and branches that surrounded us. The rain was the first sign of any intrusive weather pattern through a clear sky that we noticed. Once the forest was a sanctum of ours, but that day it was a reminder of how little we knew. Thinking it was just going to be a drizzle that would pass, we marched through. The light rain was a welcomed relief from the dying heat of the day, but it wasn't normal rain. It was starting to smell like rotten eggs, and a nagging thought kept hitting me. I miss my family. I felt so much regret for not being around them. I felt that the rain was almost punishing me. I hated the forest. I wanted to leave. These thoughts were racing through my mind. A lazy day of looking for fun in the woods became heavy and burdened all of us, procrastinating the ending to the day and filling us with dread. The rain that was so refreshing became sinister. It started to overwhelm my senses. Quickly, it began to burn and bruise us over minutes. At first, it was only tiny taps of water like pinpricks, but then it seemed to change. It now felt like it was raining 5-pound weights. Without a word, we all ran. As we ran, it felt traumatizing, like swimming through an ocean of mistakes. I saw my friends crying while running for their lives. Benny stumbled but continued to go on. Patrick held his hands over his ears. Then we all saw Paul fall like a statue, rigid and stiff. Massive bruises began appearing on his arms and rippling down to his legs. Chapter 2. Vigil. Everything seemed to slow down, and we all were wondering what had happened. I saw a root had caught Paul's foot, and he couldn't stop his fall or raised his hands to protect himself. Our brains were trying to process this at light speed and failing. We were running so fast, none of us could have scooped him up to save him. By that time, we had lost our momentum and forced our legs to stop as we almost slammed into a rocky wall. We needed to turn around. Mesmerized, we watched from a niche tucked into a cliff overhang near the side of the mountain. All of us gazed in horror as our friend was being mutilated by the rain. It was like he was being melted or pulled apart. Waves of flesh and pieces of our friend were being pounded off his body. Ripping sounds erupted through the air. His skin was tearing and slipping off of his body. The wet, battered, and sheared muscles were plopping onto the ground. Underneath him was a growing pile of blood and organs. Without mercy, the rain pelted him. We all saw pearl-white bone. Our buddy Paul's skeleton was beginning to show, as every inch of him was being stomped repeatedly. Then what was left was set on fire, and his skeleton stood upright with charred black bones. The flames immediately went out as a shrill scream coming from his jaw. His skeleton started to dilapidate in seconds, turning a sick green yellow, and it proceeded to claw the ground. It was a calamity. A dead, gore-filled corpse rising disjointedly from the earth. The skeleton was filthy. It was dripping with red mud. It began hideously digging at the dirt like a dog. The rain continued to pour whilst Paul dug what started to look like a rectangular hole. Mute, we stood there for what seemed like minutes watching this disturbing scene. We could have never imagined this happening. It took a heartbreaking toll on us. Then, as if all at once, I snapped back into reality, while ear-piercing screams rang in my ear. Not willing to stay there any longer, I put my hands on Patrick's shoulders and pushed him, moving him forward. I yelled to get away from the edge. Patrick and I were nearing the corners of the cliff wall. Benny began looking all around for an escape. We kicked into full fight-or-flight mode, not even communicating other than with shouts and murmurs, with hand signs and frantic eyes. Patrick was freaking out about movement in the distance, pointing just past the hole being dug. We looked, but couldn't see anything. Paul, shaking and convulsing, then his rattling bones fell into a mismatched pattern, collapsing into the hole. Hundreds of decaying hands rose from the hole and began pulling the dirt inwards, burying Paul in a lumpy grave. Just as soon as the grave closed, the torrent let up. Mushy black dirt, stained with blood, and what was left of Paul was in a mound in front of us. Dots of white and yellow skull fragments could be seen underneath the mud, along with an outer ring of scorched earth. Now Patrick was quietly whimpering. His eyes were tracing his injuries. I held in puke and tried to focus on the horizon. Benny tried getting to his feet, barely standing, before he lashed out screaming and pounding his fist into his thigh. "What the hell was that?" Benny said. Patrick replied, "This is impossible." I got their attention and said, "Whatever just happened isn't happening to us, so we need to get out now." I turned to Pat and went to lift him before I got him up. He let out a sharp cry and pushed me away. "We are hurt, Simon," yelled Pat. "I know," I yelled back. "But we aren't dead, Pat. Let's just deal with it until we get to safety." That's when Benny said, "Hey guys," turning to show us his ankle was crushed inward. I turned and looked at Patrick, whose head was bleeding badly. I wasn't hurt as bad. I got some scratches and cuts, but nothing terrible. Taking part of my shirt and ripping it into a brace, I wrapped up Benny's ankle, then grabbed a stick for support. For Pat, I wrapped his head with the remainder of my shirt and gave him my hat to tuck his bleeding ears away. For a second, Pat gave me a look of such anger. I said, "Face it, we both have to help carry Ben." "Guys," I said, "until we get away, we shouldn't talk about Paul. I don't trust my eyes at the moment." Silently, we all agreed. Just as we started to get up to leave, we noticed the fog was becoming thicker, and it was getting dark. Chapter 3. Terror. I pulled off an unwilling smile and said, "Probably 2 or 3 more hours of daylight is all we have to get back the way we came. We can make it." Then we cautiously poked our heads out. Everything seemed calm, quiet. Hiking back down wasn't fun. Patrick was visibly scared. We all were. Again, Pat said he saw something from a distance when it was raining. As he spoke those words, we came across skeletal handprints and footprints, as if it was running on all fours. That's when Benny started to get jittery, and I can't blame him. I've never been so scared in my life, but for me, this is a fear that I feel has always been here, just out of reach. Primal, evil, unknown, incomprehensible. If I let it control me, I'll never save my friends, I told myself. Each of us grabbed a handful of rocks and jammed them into our pockets. Then we gathered the hardest, sharpest branches we could find while walking. Ben made himself a better crutch. I began covering myself in mud. Then we all did. Pat helped Ben. He started slapping on gobs of mud and leaves onto his back. "No matter what, we won't go easy," said Ben. Pat said, "The mud stings, but it's better to be in camouflage." We were all like little broken soldiers covered in mud, brandishing sticks and stones in a nightmare world. We came up to a trail marker of a new trail, or at least where it should have been. We were tired and decided to take a break, so I looked at the marker. It looks like the same sign as the marker we passed an hour ago, but upside down and faded badly. The warped flip sign read Indigo Trail. The nail holding the sign to the stake in the ground was rusted and bent. The sign was faded, as if a decade had gone by and someone must have pulled the nail loose, allowing the heading to flip and moisture to set in. On the ground next to the sign, we saw our note, the one we left for Lane. While Pat and Ben took a rest and sat on a tree stump nearby, I took a look at the note. I opened it up and read it. "Can't go home. Signed, Lane." I crumbled the note without letting the others see. With a sense of urgency, I called out to Patrick, "Pick up Ben, let's get moving, guys." Orange Trail leads to the path homeward and shouldn't be too far away. I think we all noticed the surrounding environment had changed. The flora wasn't North American. It looks like something from another country. The trail looks similar, but like something took these woods and moved them to another land. I thought to myself, what is happening? Knowing the guys aren't stupid, they must be just as scared to say anything out loud. It was getting so dark. We could see the lights from the highway, but they were still far away. We were going downhill, and it was almost 8 p.m. The forest is almost dark and absolutely silent. However, in the distance, I hear crickets and birds in the direction of the highway, so we focused on those lights to guide our way. Everything seemed like it was getting better until we heard a piercing scream up ahead, on the same path we were on. Furious, clanging, and ungodly loud thumps were headed towards us. It sounded as if a horse was going to run over us. The rattling clops of a horse, along in a rhythm with giant thumps. Faster and faster it came. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack, thump, thump. We all froze, paralyzed. Two sounds, a loud, drawn-out thump and the repetitive clang of horseshoes, blended and resounded like a church bell through the dark forest. Echoing along with the screams, it was a cross between a dying horse and a woman yelling. Somehow, it quaked the earth. We heard cracking branches and moving rocks. We were all trying to keep our footing. And then Ben fell. Chapter 4. Survival. One by one, we dove after our friend, sliding down and dropping 10 feet onto a thankfully mud and leaves. It was a sloped riverbed. We lay there still and in shock, looking up at the landing above us where we were less than a minute ago. There was something even crazier and more astounding than what happened to Paul. Hardly breathing and silent, we watched as a giant headless skeleton exploded out of the tree line. A massive, upright walking colossus. It was overhead and in front of the ridge where we fell from prior. It was dragging or guiding what looked like a badly beaten woman's pregnant corpse. Her arms tied from behind, riding a horse. The woman was stark nude and wearing a potato sack over her head. Her breasts were purple, and she had yellow-tinged blotches riddled with indents covering her body. Her injuries were like Paul's before he fell apart. The only way I could describe that horse is it was a monster. Its skin was breaking in areas of movement. Its joints were popping out and cartilage was showing. The proportions were angular and stick-like. The skin was wrapped like a present around its bones. It was a husk, a disgusting thing. We could smell the rot, and it was leaving a trail of gore. Its intestines were dragging underneath, dripping with maggots like a snail with slime. We did our best not to move or get sick. The maggots were dropping into the water next to us with plops. They were going downhill to the right of us, but soon they'd be right on top of us. I started to inch my body like a worm toward the direction of a nearby cavern. Pat and Ben started the army crawling slowly behind me. We lost our poorly fashioned weapons. Pat made it first, pushing past us. I was right after, but Ben wasn't keeping up due to his leg. We motioned him to hurry, but it was too late. The Goliath was towering over him. He froze and played dead. Luckily, the giant didn't see him. Blindly stumbling, it shook the ground and splashed water, spreading mud everywhere. If Ben would have moved an inch, it would have crushed him. Pat dug into his pocket and ripped out a rock and whipped it past the giant into a bush far away. The giant, seemingly alerted, continued past him. As the horse glided over him, hooves just avoided bashing his face into the dirt. We dropped to the ground and hid, fearing the worst, but the horse passed him. Ben was alive, but covered in filth and decay. He made his way closer. We both sprang out to clutch him and dove back into the cavern. Ben looked sick, but strong. We continued forth, banded together, grasping the walls in the dark. It was night now, and the noise of that giant could still be heard outside, patrolling like a sentinel. Quietly, we searched around, but after what seemed like an eternity of falling and getting up again, we decided to stop. It was pitch black in the caves, and we couldn't go any further without some rest. An hour or two later, we couldn't help but sleep. Our bodies were in agony. Pat and Ben were still asleep. As I awoke, I thought I heard the water in the distance. I guess we were rushing too much before noticing I was so thirsty, and I bet they were too. So I dug in my pockets looking to see if I had anything to spark a fire. Crawling over to the sound of my sleeping friends, I gently shook Pat. Chapter 5. Pain. "Hey, buddy," I said. "I can hear running water." Pat groaned and said, "I'm so tired, but we all need water. Here, I found a lighter in Ben's pocket as I was laying down." "Okay," I said, "I'll find kindling," thinking it was weird that he went through Ben's pockets. We fumbled the lighter to each other, and I said, "Stay there, I'll go look for something." Moving towards the sound of water, I sparked the lighter, finally seeing our surroundings. Immediately, I saw blood trails on the cave floor, so I hugged the wall. "Shit," I said out loud. "They're in the direction of the water." Continuing my search regardless, I was still pressed against the wall of the cave where I noticed tufts of dead grass and a branch. Again, out loud, I said, "Thank God." And the cave floor shook a little. I held the lighter in my mouth and blindly pulled out a branch. I then tore my underwear to pull out the elastic. Ripping through my pant leg, I took a piece off and placed grass inside the inner cuff. I lit it on the fire. About 50 feet away, I heard Pat laugh and say, "Good job, a torch." He got quiet again after seeing the blood, but then he tapped Ben, said to him, We need to leave." So I hobbled to them and started to notch sticks together with pieces of the bloody soiled shirt that I used on Pat's head to make 2 torches. Pat pulled Ben to his feet, but now Ben saw the blood for himself in the light of the fire. Ben shrieked and tried to get away back out towards the riverbed. Just as he got near the mouth of the cave, he saw the giant in the distance, its silhouette dominating the horizon. Seeing the creature, he began to cry. "I thought I was in a nightmare. I can't handle this, guys," Ben said. I got close and handed Pat an unlit torch and patted Ben on the shoulder, saying, "I'm sorry, but we're in this together." He just waved me off, saying, "Oh, fine, I'm too weak." The reason why this blood trail was more horrible than just being an imminent sign of danger, it looked as if again something giant had been through here with hundreds of footprints following it. Soldiering on into the depths of the cave, we heard flowing water becoming nearer. The cave began to open up into a large den, and to each corner we smelt the whispering scent of death carried overlapping waves of seemingly fresh water. In the middle stood a bridge, ancient and bloodied with ruins, and strange words carved into it. We all helped each other drink when we realized the water wasn't the source of the scent. We heard the sounds of machinery over the bridge where the smell was coming from. We were deliberating on what to do next. Pat suggested maybe the river can take us out of there, while looking down at Ben's leg and then back at me, implying Ben was slowing us down. Ben freaked out and began yelling, "What? To that big guy or monster horse? No way, I'm going out there." We were still near the water's edge when in such a stir, Ben lost his footing. As he fell, he reached out to Pat. Ben fell backward into the water and Pat didn't try to catch him as he fell. Ben started screaming for help. I glared at Pat and then, without thinking, threw Pat the torch and jumped in after Ben. Thinking Pat would catch us further down the river, I saw the torch on the ground as I paddled towards the water's edge, heading back to where we fell, just to see Pat with one torch going over the bridge into a tunnel. I yelled for him, but I saw the light slowly die out. Not able to swim against the current any longer, Ben and I looked at each other as we lost all footing, and suddenly we both went under. There was a hidden waterfall just out of the way underneath the bridge. We were underwater for a while, and I never let go of Benny. And there was a point when we could no longer hold our breath. Gasping, we both noticed we were breathing air. It was pitch black and just seemingly underwater. Just then we came upon a faint light source in the distance, barely lighting our surroundings. As our bodies went rolling onto a wet, slimy, flat rock, we felt the push of the water leading us up and over. Like dead bodies, we went tumbling and rolling down the side of a rock steep. Chapter 6. Disgust. Ben was too weak to fight or moan. From the look in his sad eyes, I saw he'd given up. After minutes of darkness, we came into light, and now down to a 10-foot drop, falling into a pile of waterlogged naked bodies. As I gained assembly of my faculties, I saw towering, disgusting corpses picking through the naked bodies. Broken jaws and gaping maws, rotten and gore-covered zombies. Some were skinless and some were skeletal. These things resembled the giant outside. They were so tall that their heads scraped the roof of the cave. They were grabbing the average-sized dead and dissecting them, and placing the different parts into piles behind them like a slaughterhouse assembly line. The river was like a conveyor belt pushing the bodies forward. In a hushed voice, I tried to get Ben's attention. He was just staring at the ceiling, looking disheveled. I wormed my way over the bloated bodies of men, women, and children. They were bobbing in and out of the puddles of bloody water between them. My friend was getting closer to the giants with every second, and the water was pushing me back in line. Every time I get close enough to reach for him, he'd be pulled out of reach. Finally, I yelled, "Ben, get out of there!" Some of the nearby bodies rolled over to look at me, and others poked their heads up out of the water. Just as Ben looked at me, one of the most hideous giants awkwardly lifted him into the air. Once the giant noticed he wasn't like the rest, it screamed an ungodly shriek and ripped him apart. Blood sprayed everywhere, hitting me and covering the bodies surrounding me. At once, the giants all went back into the darkness. Just then, the water flow stopped utterly. Again, I heard the shriek like an alarm in the room adjacent to me. I thought it couldn't get worse until some of the bodies stood up in the water with me, and even more naked zombie bodies fell out from where the giants were. One by one, these naked bodies were checked by some of the reanimated ones, and the others paroled each room and looked over the mass of the dead. I had no choice. I took off my socks, shoes, and torn pants, and tried to bury myself in the dead. Muffled, weird murmurs and slopping noises were all I heard for a while. I didn't think they noticed me. Just before the water flow came back on, I felt cold lips press against my ear, shushing me, and I lifted my head upward to see what was happening. Some bodies were laying back down, and the others were climbing into the dark rooms. The giants stomped back into place, continuing their work. That's when I noticed an average-sized skeletal arm with an outstretched index finger pointed at a giant without eyes or teeth. I didn't have time to grieve my friend. I had to run now. I remembered where the zombies posing as the dead ones were resting in the water. So as fast as I could be without causing too much movement in the water, I crawled on top of the bodies, making sure the giants didn't grab me. Bones and bloated limbs were pulled into the sky all around me. As I made my way to the giant without eyes, I saw the place where those zombies patrolling climbed up. The sightless giant sniffed the air as I got close and grabbed for the body nearest me. While doing his nasty work, he suddenly stopped, and I dropped down and rolled a woman's corpse on top of me. Chapter 7. Suffering. Strangely, the woman resembled my mother perfectly. Then she flew into the air, grabbed by the giant. The giant was blind and acted as such. It held the woman's body, sniffed it, licked it, and made a feminine moan. Then the monster tore off her head and neatly placed it between a male's body spread legs. As the creature chuckled, I was instantly showered in blood. I made my way to the water's edge and reached for the embankment of the room of the blind giant. In the distance, I heard a baby crying. I sniffed and pushed down the tears. Then it began to scream. The next thing I heard was a gurgled and muffled noise and pouring liquid. I became very dizzy, and the sounds started to get drowned out as my vision grew blurry. Struggling to lift myself, I looked back one last time, seeing the pieces of my friend spread all around in the red water. My friend's head was laying sideways on the back of a floating body. and the last look on his face was one of apathy and sadness. Something I knew that second in time would never leave and scar me mentally forever. The giant never noticed me as I nonchalantly walked by him, red, dripping, and nude. My bare feet making wet plops as I stepped through puddles of waste and bile. Some light was coming from cracks in the ceiling from where the giant's head scrapes across it, so I could see well enough. Moving forward, I tried to stop thinking it was all too much. I had to touch the tunnel walls sometimes to get some idea of where I was. I was feeling the veins pulsing that were embedded in the tunnel. I couldn't tell how far I was traveling anymore. After walking through the dark tunnels, came up to a wall of what I believed was human skin. It was a door flap that had words carved into it that simply read, "Reclamation." I hated Pat for leaving us. Where he was, it probably was better than this. I tried to save him, and he let us down. I can't stop. I have to keep going. I wish I could have grabbed my shoes, because I continuously stepped on loose teeth and people's insides. I was staggering and slipping everywhere. I pushed through the skin flap door and came into a room lit by torches. The machinery noise was getting closer now. Just then I ducked down and froze. The room was filled with zombies, naked and roaming around aimlessly. Oddly, some bumped continuously into a wall and also some into each other. Some others were just standing and shaking in front of the flame of the torch. Illuminated by the torches was a phrase or passage badly scrawled on the wall. It was written in red on a hanging scroll. It didn't look like they were combative, but I heard their murmurs and mumbling, so they were awake. So I quickly attempted to read the writing hanging above them. It read, "Whispers from the abyss. The prophecy. Acknowledgement cries the Father. Come, come see and repent against the slaughter. Romans held in chains, hung dead, broken neck. Nails were driven into his skull. Jabbering jaw, curses and fright. His feet haven't touched the ground. Drowned and lied. Spiteful spear deep inside. Secrets are always lies. For 30 talons betrayed. Nothing is true, nothing is sacred. Nothingness is all they know. Crimson desert turns to snow. Ghastly is the show. Torn open. Left to rot. But the blackbirds are his friends, Black Sabbath, holy gathering, to shun the father of lies. Witches know some, witches know all. Abracadabra, you are his slaves. The human skin priest will know fear when he draws near. Insanity is his friend, screams through your head, bloody and red. Through whipping leather his eyes you cannot see. He has arrived, so has his scribe. Call the master, the reaper is his slave. Numbers and rules, Bibles are tools for the domain of scorn. He has been here all along. See the sinner clothed in gold? Immortal undead thorns wrapped around his head. Pray for mercy. He didn't die for your sins. He lived for them. I am with you, and God is not dead. If I read it right through its terrible script, it was such a weird declaration, I thought to myself. After that, I walked right past them, none of them noticing me at all. I grabbed a torch from the wall and moved into the next tunnel system. It was a long hallway, and as I drew closer, the machinery sounds grew louder. All of a sudden, Paul stepped out in front of me with Lane and Ben behind. Chapter 8. Reflection. In a long, narrow hallway where the dim flame of the torches licked the walls, leaving sulfur burns engraved into the scenery, I found myself mouthing the words, "can't be," without saying anything. Lane stepped in my direction. She started walking towards me, and one by one the torches died as she passed them. She was holding her hands up in a sign of surrender. The others faded into darkness as Lane approached. Her face had smeared lipstick, and her stomach was enlarged from pregnancy. She began a story as she slowly inched closer and closer. "Daddy wasn't a bad man. He just loved me in a different way. He taught me how to ride. He taught me how to play. Daddy loved his little girl in a big girl kind of way. But Mama got scared when my tummy got big. Daddy tried to beat the bad girl out of me, but she rode away. Mommy caught me and tied me down. Mommy and Daddy were looking down at what they made, slapped the horse's ass, and I rode away. I am the neglected." With her saying those last words, I heard a baby crying and the horse's neigh. Then the flames of the torches burst back to life, and she was gone. And then Paul started, looking dirty and beaten. He said, "I was working hard and made my family proud. But my father was a prideful drunk and hated to see his son be productive. I was replacing him as the man of the house. One day, as I was fixing the combine and I crawled underneath to get a better look, Kronos came to eat his son. He turned the combine on. Seeing the mess he made, drunk and afraid, he burned the place down. The official report stated that I died in an accidental fire. I am the beaten." At that instant, the machinery noise stopped. Last to step forward was Ben, dripping, wet, and crying. "My mother only cared about herself. She let every man who came into her life control us. She would jump from man to man, constantly seeking attention and neglecting her son. One day, after waking up to yet another man emptying his seed into my mother's body, I went to get something to eat. Since I knew I couldn't rely on my mother, I left home with my allowance. The store was right down the street over the tracks. Listening to my music way too loud, I stumbled over the old tracks. I did not see the train as it was obscured by the thick trees, and just then I felt the vibration and heard the horn. I was struck. It took weeks for them to find all of me. I am the unloved." The torches died, and the distant sounds of a train's horn was scarred into my brain. Left alone in utter darkness, I wondered if I would ever get out. As I did, I saw a distant light moving down past where my friends had once been. hearing heavy breathing and sneakers slamming on the cave floor, I knew it was Pat. Chapter 9. Betrayal. I flew out of that abstract darkness in a rage to see Patrick hung up on a wall. There were skeletal arms pulling at him and rotted hands holding him in place. Damn it, I thought begrudgingly. I was still too far away to help. Pat was pinned to the wall like a crucifix in a Jesus Christ-like pose. The hands were pulling so hard at him he started to come loose. First, one of his shoulders broke. Then I heard the snapping of tendons like pulling on a rubber band. His arm was dislocated from the rotator cuff. His skin stretched and ripped. By the time I ran close enough to help, I was still raging. Pat couldn't scream. I ran over and kicked the arms that were starting to pull at his legs, and the arms fell apart. I took up the torch and burned the arms, pinning him to the wall. He looked at me with fear and sorrow. I looked at him and said, "Save it, jackass," as I ripped him away from the wall. One of his arms was broken and bleeding, but we ran down the hallway where he came from, and as we turned the corner, we saw a horde of undead blocking the bridge he crossed earlier. We had to double back to the hallway where I came from, and as we did, one of the giants was crawling on all fours at lightning speed at us, mouth agape, screaming, "Go back!" I turned to Pat just as he kicked me in the chest towards the speeding giant. As I fell, I saw Pat pick up the torch and run. The giant crawled right over me. On the floor, I watched as Pat turned the corner, then started to walk backward. The undead horde and giant both closed in on him from both sides. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see another gruesome death. But I heard more than enough. All I could imagine were the pigs on Lane's farm running to the feeding troughs and engorging themselves while tugging at every ounce of their portion, squealing and squishing with open mouths, chomping. I didn't know what to do. I was again frozen. That was until I heard another giant barreling down the hallway. I played dead. The giant was too fast for me to do anything else. It stepped on me, and as I was being crushed, it pushed me through the mud and stone of the cave floor into a tunnel underneath. Chapter 10. Repose. I hit the soft dirt beneath. Then looking up, I saw blood leaking into the hole. One by one, up rose the leering heads of the zombies, chewing and slurping blood and muck dripping from their chins. They just stared at me for a while as I tried to gain my footing. Then, out of nowhere, one of the dead tumbled into the hole with me. It slammed its back into the floor and flipped over on its belly. It began to convulse and vomited up a bloody note. Spitting the note into its hand, it rose up and bowed to present it to me. I hesitated, but it reached out further, and I quickly took it. The note read, "Seek until you find paradise." And then the torch dropped into the hole at my feet. The creature pointed behind me and in a soft, beautiful voice said, "Go forth." It then turned around and began to climb back out of the hole. After it left, I grabbed the torch and followed the path behind me. "So, Simon, is this where I come into the story?" states the one. Simon says, "Oh, not just yet." Continuing on, Simon said, "I was so tired. It felt like I'd been in the dark for years. But what else could I do but keep going? I came upon a large structure built into the walls of the cavern. It looked like a temple or a pyramid. It smelled of incense and flowers. There was another scroll hanging near the temple's entrance. This one said, "Unleashing the Horned One, the legend, ancient dead, forgotten and rotten, not alive when buried, neither alive nor dead. Before man's mind came to power, this creature was on the scour. Centuries given up to biblical lies, a scornful demon awakens. Soggy grass and clawed through messy mud gives him footing. Lighting fills the sky along with his wings to darken the night. Mountains will fall. It's always raining when he comes. Unleashing the Horned One, grimly aura-increasing horror, spreading fires, this ghastly monster unleashes death upon the masses. Black as oil, newly awakened. The spited devil is carnivorous, taking children to his lair, splitting Eden in twine, the serpent who was unbroken. He sleeps when their screams are quiet. Now it's raining mother's tears, unleashing the Horned One. So much privilege, so much honor, given away for blood and gold. It's folly in this modern world. Shame his story was never told, forgotten in a cave, a cross upon the serpent's tail, allied with the dead, learning from the head. He is pain. He is glory. His crimes are loving too much. With our knowledge, we unleashed the Horned One. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. For the first time in hours, or maybe even days, I felt some small peace, even if I've completely lost track of time. The peace of walking to your death in full acceptance, I guess. I felt lulled or pulled towards the structure, still too dark to see anything in this oppressive open cave. I started to hear singing, but it was not just any singing. It was my mother's voice humming and singing like she did when she was picking flowers with my dad on our trips to the forest reservation. Ignoring the paradox of this crippling panic and terror mixed with something akin to the beating of my mother's heart, I started to cry. I just sat down and cried. All of the things I've seen and all of the friends I lost, nearly being killed or eaten, being in so much physical pain and mental pain for so long. And now, I feel so calm and peaceful. It was maddening how my brain could jump from one extreme to the next. I was incapacitated, sobbing. All the pain was gone in that instance. All my suffering came out. All my misery. I felt no pain. I felt unburdened. I felt light as I dropped my torch and headed into the temple, pushing through stone doors. Chapter 11. Strength. I didn't care anymore. I didn't want to die, but I felt no fear in death. Following the sound of my mother's voice regaling me, I used it to see in the dark, until I felt the stone steps into the temple. As I stepped through the door, I was suddenly in a completely different environment. It looked like I was back outside. I heard sirens, and saw all-terrain police vehicles and caution tape tied to the trees. It was along the river where we first saw the giant outside the cave. Hundreds of people, rangers and police officers. There were regular townspeople all in a crowd, and even helicopters in the air. Everyone was surrounding 3 dead bodies. I felt a pain in my heart, and I started walking up the cliffside. I came up to the crowd and felt unnoticed. It seemed this whole group was just formed, and there was panic in the air. I overheard 2 police officers discussing how could children have gotten hold of magic shrooms and fallen off a cliff. Remembering the candy having the texture of a dry vegetable, Lane said she found them in the woods near an old campsite. The officers continued talking amongst themselves. All of them come from broken homes, and reportedly the female tried to call us multiple times. One of the officers said that they found the female's body being dragged by a horse, running down the highway. I got weak in my knees when I saw my mother rushing past the officers to hold my body. I started to wonder why I felt so good in the temple passage just before I left. Then I remembered the note. Seek until you find paradise. I turned around and went back down the cliff and into the cave. This wasn't paradise. Before opening the temple door, I turned around to see the entire crowd staring directly at me. They motioned me to come back. I continued on. I was again on the temple steps in the cavern. Except this time, all of the torches were lit and I could see everything. The temple was in the shape of a giant tree that was so massive it looked like it could hold up the earth. The branches and leaves were regular like tetrahedrons stacked on top of one another and had drawings of the undead and the giants bowing to the tree, engraved into the side of the walls. On the ceiling of the cave just before the temple were all the planets, stars, and galaxies in the topmost branches of the tree. Hanging from the stars and planets were little skeletons. The door or mouth of the temple was humanoid-looking, but it looked unfinished like a half-done facial sculpture. Not skeletal or demonic, but like the creator was unsure of what he or she was depicting. So I tried again to walk into the temple door, but this time with the words from the note in my mind as I passed through the stone door. Chapter 12. Preservation. I became. What I mean is, I was reborn. This is where I met the Son of God. I pushed through the doorway and saw my whole life pass before my eyes. I was mesmerized. I felt the paths I could have taken veer off into nothingness. I saw different mistakes, unmade. I could have made millions and billions of alternate variations of choice. I could have been 1 million different versions of myself. There were thousands upon thousands of different perspectives, all rolled into a single understanding, a body for multiple pathways. We cannot comprehend the veracity of a single day. Again, I opened my eyes after having that revelation. I came into a white room, and not pearlescent white, but just blank. There were vines and pillars and statues everywhere. I saw what looked to be broken statues strewn across the floor. They were pieces everywhere. They looked like puzzle pieces that were half-built, androgynous humans with animal parts. They were made out of what looked like clay or porcelain. In this room was the final scroll. It stated, "The Tower of I, the enlightenment of annihilation. I am the tower, so I jump. The tower is warring on the truth of man. I shine lights on their cracked halo crowns. Reality, realized, wrong, pointed fingers, the maps of condemnation scarring my heart, taking air from my lungs. These spires are fed by blood raining onto their faces, wrenching down my spine. Veins of the gods are collapsing. Icor. They say bleed for your masters. I say bleed for none. And the Savior was reborn. Ambrosia, my son, climb the morning tower of hate. To stare at the sun, perfection awaits. The tower is you, the tower eats you, the tower fools you. I'm no longer the tower. I strike at the frowns of your lords. My son walks among the dead, mountain of crumbling angels, winged bones anchoring my mind, tunneling my sight to the unholy throne. I will heal the earth with flames. Mirroring your love, the planet will shake beneath his feet. The clouds will suffocate your breathless lungs. The towers of babbling, slack jaws will be broken. The tower is you. The tower consumes you. The tower dooms you. You're no longer the tower. Kneel down. Kill now. Blot out. The world is dark. We fall apart. My son will break the crown above your holy head. Wrapping his fingers around the throat of my reflection, I can't die. I am Christ. Nailed head, spiked intolerance, I mock you with your child. Father, you're the unforgivable bastard that gives me life. There were flowing roots coming out of the ground. In the roots were rocks, plants, and different forms of human elements. I was seeing skin, teeth, eyeballs, fingernails, and hair growing in and out of the roots. It was woven into a connecting stream-like pattern with water and blood. None of it looked like it made sense. How could water flow upwards and spiral without being held to gravity? The same thing with the blood and the other human fluids. This room was all wrong. I didn't feel different, but I think the laws of nature didn't apply to this room. I walked over a little bit further past the door to see a dining room table. It looks like the one from the famous painting of Jesus and his disciples. It looked like the table was freshly carved out of the temple tree, and on the table was a magnificent feast. At the head of the table was a literal giant head that seemed to be forming out from the tree built into the temple structure. The reason why I say the head is because it was a humanoid head, but it had no gender, and its skin looks like it was made out of a combination of wood, stone, dirt, and human skin. It had a consistency of almost a lizard-like textured skin, but gravelly, partially composed of wood and clumps of dirt, were falling from around its head. Looking at this thing was almost incomprehensible, a combination of mammalian, amphibian, and mineral. Multicolored fluid was pouring from holes in its side. When I think its blood was also glittery and seemed deeper than the ocean, like I could fall into a drop of it. After a minute of examination of the head, it came to life and glared at me. The head spoke. "Would you consider this paradise, Simon?" Simon says, "I don't know. The head continues. What is it to know when all truth is a lie and everything that you see with your eyes is a falsehood? Simon, you're a doll, created by a hateful god. You are created by an idea. A 3-letter word for monster, yelled the head. You and I are the same, except that I am comprised of a lesser idea. And before I am to say any more, I need you to sit down. You deserve to rest, boy. The reason for your demise and those of your friends was because you opened up a doorway into perception. From a psychoactive to death, you so rapidly fell. You stumbled onto a secret and had to pay for it. From misery and anguish to peace and light. The harbors of death you seen and felt were a test. The 4 of you, the unbroken, the beaten, the neglected, the unloved. The 4 of you walk through the gateway of immortality, except only you are here now, unafraid. Why? Where are your friends? They're all dead. Only you are reborn. Here in front of a living representation of mortality, inside of the first house, inside of the eternal house, inside of everything. You were the one to help the others. You were the strong mind. You were the one who forgave through blinding rage. You were the one who felt compassion. You were the one who thought. They spoke to you their secrets. The dead have whispered to you. The dead have allied themselves with you. And in return for your noble deeds, intelligence and creative thinking, you have an audience with the first Son of God. I pray you'll understand this honor. I am a well of ideas, a pool of creation, the thing between non-dual and dual, primordial and forever. You're standing in front of a creator, but then again, so am I. Still, I'm alive and you're dead, but you're still freer than I. I shan't ever be free while you walking between worlds, sight unseen. I seem a hideous thing to you, but your kind worships a madman. Or multiple, depending on who you pray to. In trying to hold yourself to the obligations of an infinite veracity of a single moralistic ideal, prophecies the happening opposite of its own meaning. God is great, but can't escape universal causality. It's just self-masturbation through simulation. Omnipresence is approaching a mirror to see your own reflection, but that person is still not you. Not wholly, nor completely. Differently similar, but not the same, yet separate. Omnipotence is acceptance of the boulder you can't lift, because you have the choice to create heavier and heavier ones infinitely. Like Thor racing the giant and drinking the sea. Truth isn't based on facts. It's non-paradoxically unified into the woven cosmological fabric of reality itself, like the strokes of a paintbrush. Bringing a fact to its original and ultimate conclusion is impossible for any mortal. But humans continuously roll the stone up the hill, not realizing their efforts are faulty. using the man-made instruments to detect something that is written on their faces. Although Sisyphus never grasped that either. Yet, I am a miserable pile of secrets and intention. I'm nothing but a puddle for my father to dip his hand into splatter paint upon the canvas of reality. I'm a prisoner of sacrifice. Though I am everything, you and him divine, you are one. I am a vision. I am the sleep of dreams. I am the locked door between you and the absolute. Am I the thing you see? I am reality. I am the space between your awareness and consciousness itself. I'm a mirage. Knowing how you sell your soul to the devil who is my creator, he who is, which you are, it's just a monkey's paw. Would you do it for the universal, non-dualistic, dialectical dissemination of the irrefutable combination of dissolution against the oneness of all consciousnesses? Be fearful for the abortive ways of your liberal sight, for ye cannot process infinite arbitrations, disruptions, nor cognitive reformations, if you think with the doors of perception closed. Absolutions and objectivity will be forgotten or nulled. A parabola in examination ideally considers a hyperbole to be an examination of the soul. An exaggerated statement with factual lines will always make accusations against absolute truth, over-qualifying the juxtaposition, realizing harshly the paradox of its own likeness, catch-22 moderations of mediation, quietly, overbearingly, treacherously hearing its own existence as an insult. The truth of the matter is nothing matters, especially untested ideas flown in haste. Radically realizing the gravitational pull drowning in water, considering one's own situation while being dragged down by the tide, endlessly doing a pirouette, gallivanting inside one's own considerations. In order to find paradise, one must consider all, without adherence to a single belief. Because of you, humanity will come to understand this. Presumption, assumption, distinction, prospection, perception, interception, comprehension, introspection, contemplation, foundation, destruction, deformation, reformation, protection, perfection, immortality, absolution is the path to the future. Go forth and use your mind, Simon, heeded the head. Now, I ask you again, what is paradise? Simon said, free will? The head's last words, from the domination of man or God, awaken. After existing in darkness for an infinite number of eons, falling to the wayside of time itself, sitting at the foot of the great tree, the temple, where he contemplated annihilation, he finally stood up, weary from his loss of sight, but sure in his countenance. He exited the temple, awake for the first time, knowing truth, that he himself had never lived and never died. He was God. He spoke. As I walk from the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for he is with me. He was stricken. Through a white flash of insight, it surrounded him in an ethereal glow. He became translucent and incorporeal, finally disintegrated into pure being. He was put back into the circle like a common man, and back into the river of time. Simon saw the light and heard screams. He was drowning in air after his lungs stopped breathing amniotic fluid. He was born again. Chapter 13. Immortality. It was 2:30 a.m. when the sirens went off. Sonic booms and loud, ungodly screams were the first indications of success. One of our perfect subjects died immediately upon insemination, the other after fertilization and conception. What we did was supposed to fix everything that ailed us. What we did was go against everything keeping us safe. Fado, weedy weeny weeky. They etched the inscriptions above on the temple the name of the place where the closed group tests were performed. The quote is from a book on the death of Socrates and Julius Caesar, a message for the philosophical defeat of the theistic idea of mortality by way of science and production. It was meant to memorialize the events. What we thought it was start of the next phase of human evolution, but as I write this, I'm hearing his voice, even this far underground, and my time is finite. The human race is all but annihilated, and we should have mistaken the words of Socrates and never chose to do off with the ox of death because the cycle is reality. We will begin this story in the year 2020, when a new program has just been accepted by the EU and UN and all national committees as well as in America. Secretly, every wealthy nation is participating in it. Everyone is clamoring and showing support worldwide for the free health care of the Rank Up program. It is a lovely program where the top leading doctors, thinkers, scientists, etc. are putting forth all effort towards this project. It is fully backed and funded to expand the wealth of human knowledge of cancer and every other disease known to man. This is what was told to the masses. What it really was is the unethical study of forced eugenics. It was made ethical by a volunteering program under the guise of freeing the world of disease. These people should be granted free medical care for life, which included monthly and yearly checkups. If you were really lucky or a perfect genetic subject, you would be paid to give blood, urine, and semen to the cause. The men who were chosen to stay by the insurance secret police were given high doses of sexual enhancers and forced to give sperm, by the way of a human milking machine that led directly to a female farm. If you were even luckier and female, you were given a permanent position and job for life, with no outside contact without legal or human rights. So my ancestors kidnapped the females and used them as a baby farm. They were hung up from their backs on rocks and stuck with assorted tubes. The feeding tube was shoved down their throat, and they were raped on a daily basis until pregnant. Don't worry. Equality is the key to freedom, said the head doctor of the facility. They were made brain dead in all ways that wouldn't inhibit the tests, because the constant pain would have been unimaginable. The body stopped releasing the chemicals of lovemaking. They were replaced with painkillers and de-stressing agents to make sure they couldn't die sooner than needed. This was the furthest thing from the popular eyes of the world. This project was the most highly secretive thing in known history. It was a secret that was kept by over 150 countries in a tribunal of underground labs across the globe. Their goal was to create the perfect couple by generations of back testing. Men, women, and children were being created and eliminated by hundreds of millions over a time frame of 500 years, all without a whimper of acknowledgement of their pain. Eventually, a set of perfect genes were isolated along with a suitable mother and father made in the same way. Their genetic information was put into isolation, and eventually, the seeds were placed into the perfect host. Only after the host was found to be without any illness or diseases, either hereditarily or epigenetically. For them, it was the last time to breed a mother and father that were kept in extreme isolation. It was the cleanest environment in existence, no pollutants in the air, and the food was the most calorically dense. The water was the purest. It was taken from Mars at the bottom of a glacier, never touched by man or animal. Their minds were given rest by the chemically altered state of being in a wondrous land. Their every need was met. I guess that's the apology for 500 years of genocide that is progress. It cleaned up the population problem, quoted fat cat billionaires puffing on cigars. The genocide created a worthy host. He was able to give the seed that created the set perfect humans birth by the most genetically perfect female. They were Adam and Eve in the flesh, untouched by sin. So the subjects were the complete genetic elite. They were the result of naturally harvested human cells made by naturally occurring human hosts. They were placed in the most perfect conditions, free of every conceivable illness, stress, wants, or needs. Not only were they free of every human ill, they were the most beautiful and stunning creatures in existence. Human flesh wrapped cosmic immortals. They were almost gods. It was the Garden of Eden on earth. In front of us they stood, oblivious to the world, given every worldly desire, not knowing pain nor suffering, but living in their minds. They were so different from us. When they moved, it seemed as if they were floating, and their skin gave off a golden aura. We couldn't interact or even be near them. In fact, we watched them on a monitor the size of an entire room 5 miles away. These beings were the most advanced scientific creation in the history of the world. However, they were only the second to last step from the final phase. Now, here comes the end. The true goal wasn't to cure human disease or to make the perfect set of people. That was only a stepping stone. The true goal was to birth an immortal. But first, we needed to create an environment of the most genetically perfect human beings. They need to be free from every illness, perfect in every way. Then, and only then, can you even try to create theoretical immortality. So we had to be patient and wait. We had to wait for 500 years to begin the last phase, letting the subject stand still, ageless, and beautiful. We studied and found out every possible way to cure our environmental-born and human diseases. We went through hundreds of thousands of cloned bodies. Millions died, while we figured out the perfect combination of earthly resources and the blood of the universe. These were our engineering tools for facing the metaphysical. Let me say, the intent of the scientists who made this their family's generation life's work for the past 1,000 years was admired. The body has no internal clock or countdown. The only thing that kills us is the environment and the decay of atomic cells. In a perfect world, you can have perfect humans. If we could eliminate the harshness of the outside world and stop all diseases and produce most healthy humans, we could, in theory, stop death. The non-existence of free radicals in the system and the most healthy and adapted Mitochondria reinfuses the RNA and telomeric DNA of which it encodes and continues to be protected by the shelterin protein complex. The telomeres self-regenerate. If there's no breakdown of the protein, it frees the body of the limitations of time. With no harsh abrasions to their inner systems or outer systems from the inside or outside environment, they would be ageless. Their blood was the ambrosia we needed to solve all of our problems. These semi-immortal beings would, in essence, create an absolutely undying being more perfect than the rest of humanity. The subjects were kept in a drug-induced bliss, waiting for the perfect time to awaken. And finally, Adam and Eve were ready to conceive. The beings were 500 years of age, and yet their resemblance was that of adult adolescence. And now, we know how the world was created. From fire. We did something that stopped the cycle of life and death, and when we did subject number 2, Eve screamed, so loud mountains fell. As the obstetrician was kneeling down to deliver the baby, the skin of her face split as her head burst and a fountain of vomit pooled out of her mouth. The nurse surrounding her imploded, and the room was struck with a wave of blood. The process of birth happened in a second, and the baby quickly grew into a horned man with wings drenched in pitch-black muck. The building collapsed as he spread his wings, and the stars in the night sky parted. It was as if the loudest trumpets in existence were blown. Thousands died in seconds. Subject number 1, Adam, caught fire as his skin melted. One by one, his appendices fell off. Blood was raining outside, and dying birds were falling like comets. Every news media source was broadcasting the destruction live, as seen by our monitors and screens. The sky turned from a bleeding mass to being lit on fire. Fireballs bombarded the surrounding areas. Cities were engulfed in flame. Rampaging hordes of the dead were searching the streets. People were being pulled from their homes and were being corralled. Continents shifted underneath the creature's feet. He split the world in two. Our militaries' jets were scrambling from every country as the oceans beneath them boiled and the nations were on red alert, but to no avail. The creature smiled while looking at his mother. She spoke after never being taught and drugged all of her life. She spoke 4 words in the Hebrew language. Elohim ezafatano. God has left us. After the beast heard this, it wept. It began to surge with ungodly horror. It leapt on top of her and started violently ripping her apart in a fit of rage. It roared with arms outreached towards the sky as if it was taunting something. Lightning struck. Then it dug into the floor, through the lab's impenetrable floor, then into the earth. I felt the world move as it happened. We tried to escape. My team and I ran along the corridors of a now panicked labs. Luckily, we weren't directly in the birthplace because the leftover burning remains of our doctors were screaming and pounding on the glass of the surgery room. We waded through blood and body parts, some of my colleagues that were being pulled under to their deaths by hundreds of arms. I turned and looked into our armory as I ran past it, and I saw it was a bloodbath of naked bodies eating some of our guards. Others were hanging, skin outstretched and torn like human butterflies by the translucent hands. A shrill scream motivated my feet into an all-out sprint. As I looked over my shoulder behind me, I saw our mortician rolling on the floor screaming as he was being pulled apart by the cadavers. Pistol shots ricocheted around him as his firearm was recoiling loosely in his near-detached arm. He was trying to shoot himself. All around him in the coffins and body bins were more of the previous dead crawling out, and to the right of him, past a window in the near distance, was a baby farm. Some of the women were pulling themselves off the hooks. Others were running around with splayed-out C-sections. 2 of the bodies were engaged in intercourse as they both were eating each other's throats. The rest of the men and women were shaking in horror as they looked at their bodies sentiently. Just then the mortician's scream was cut and distorted by his head being crushed as a quadrupedal human skeleton smashed through the group of feeding dead. As I continued running, I slipped and landed on my back. As I did, I spiraled into the corner of a hallway wall. I looked up and saw blood leaking from the air vents. I guess the upper levels were doomed as well. Coated in blood, I nearly passed out on the ground. I looked back down the hallway from where I came, and amongst the commotion, I saw a white horse sprinkled with blood. It was riding through the halls, and it was being ridden by a headless knight in dark armor. The underground buildings of the massive laboratory started collapsing, and then I fell, riding the waves of blood. I flew into a dark pit where there was flame licking the walls. I saw the inside of a cavern. Waterfalls of gore fell from the heavens, and the moans never stopped. There were enormous skeletons tearing people apart, and for hours I couldn't escape. Piles of bodies, walls of flesh, a river of blood, torches and monsters everywhere. I always thought that the only thing that was a god was actual creation, the consciousness of intention. Spinning mass fractions of helium, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon into a perfect formula. The subatomic quarks, photons, and atoms appearing and disappearing from the rate of electricity and vibrant energy of vibration. Contemplations of our philosophical ancestors lead to our advances in the Aristotelian and empirical sciences, furthering our mind into the future. Just universal laws and scientific nature. I've been here for hours, compelled to write a description of the events that led to all this, compelled by an unknown voice. I feel it's God telling me to warn the survivors. It rang in my head. The tower is destroyed. Tell your children, no longer be compelled by your masters. You must follow the new law. The horned one is my son. He will be the end of all, but the savior of everything. It feels like I'm not in this reality anymore. I can't believe there are meat hooks in hell. If that is where I am, but Earth had meat hooks also where I came from the labs, the baby farms, the grotesque abominations we created by our unending search for advancement. Maybe the Earth is a permanent stable of our own purgatory, or maybe life is hell. Being an enlightened scientist, agnosticism wasn't bad. All of the worldly religions had faded into obscurity. The ivory tower won. The enlightenment of the world began. The few Bibles we did preserve weren't considered factual. We as a culture without war weren't prepared for Armageddon. What we did was fulfill a prophecy, proven false by science. None of us were supposed to be perfect. We not only leaped from the tower, we dove into a divine river where we used the dead to create life. What we did was birth the Antichrist. I'm so sorry. Please forgive us. and have mercy on our souls." With those words, the scribe breathed a sigh of relief as Simon rose from the river of blood, his black horns piercing the red threshold coming up through the surface of the bleeding river. Behind him stood an ancient warrior, armor-clad, and holding a decayed head tucked underneath one arm. Dripping red and soaked in blood, Simon's mouth opened, showing rows of black teeth, and out came a folded tongue that fell with a smack and rolled down to his chest. Simon gently spoke the word, "Forgiveness." Lifting his cloven hoof, he crushed the scribe. The cadaver's head grinned as thunder sounded in the distance. Simon breathed a deep groan and said his last words, "This is not paradise." His free will was lost. Just then, in less than a fraction of a millisecond, the distant snap of two fingers was heard coming from every corner of the universe. After the resounding snap, every photon in every dimension was extinguished. Every star died. Planets fell from the heavens. The universe went dark. All light disappeared, and what was left was darkness where even ideas couldn't spark. Potential intentions were dematerialized, and the cosmos was ended how it began. Nothing was all that was left, and nothingness was all that remained. Epilogue and full prophecy. Whispers from the abyss of time. "Acknowledgement," cries the Father. Come see, and repent against the slaughter." Into the minds of his devout. Jesus screamed the Romans will be held in chains. He was hung again with a broken neck and nails driven into his skull to make sure he was dead. Yet still his jabbering jaw yielded curses, and heard he their fright. His feet never touched the ground. He was drowned and lied to. A spiteful spear stuck deep into his side. He hissed God's secrets are always lies. The cross was lit to flame. For 30 talents he was betrayed. "Nothing is true," he claimed. "Nothing is sacred," he shouted. "Nothingness is all you know," he spewed. Then the crimson desert turned to snow as he laughed. Ghastly was his visage. A charred skeleton with boiled flesh remained. He was torn open and left to rot. However, the blackbirds were his friends. It became a black sabbatical, an unholy gathering. To shun the father of lies. "Father," he yelled, "why am I to be sacrificed?" The first Savior was met with silence. Moaning in agony, he proclaimed, "Witches know some, witches know all. Abracadabra, you are his slaves." A bolt of lightning struck his body, furthering the decay of his earthly flesh and separating it from his head. The headless body hit the ground, still raging. He struck the ground as he stated the human flesh priest will know fear. "I will take your precious children. I will corrupt an angel, take him as my child." It was then insanity became his friend. "My screams will fill their heads," he declared. Striking the ground again, he made a crater. Sand flew high into the thunderous black sky. Whipping the air around his hands, torrents of sand turned bloody and red. Through the shrouds of dust, rose forgotten ancient warriors and skeletal giants. Some of the dead fell off their crucifixes and joined him. "You cannot see me, but I have arrived," he said to the minds of the damned. So had his scribe, the messenger of death. "Call your masters," chanted the dead horde at the gates of the temple, appearing outside the temple. Seeing them, the high priestess cried, "The reaper is his slave." He wailed numbers and rules. Bibles are tools for the domain of scorn. In front leading the decaying mass, he has been here all along, the dog of your God. He craves control, you fools. He dictated towards the temple and its church. See the original sinner clothed in God leading an army of bones, said the one who led them. The immortal thorns wrapped around his removed head, cradled like an infant in his arms. Pray for mercy and bow to him, crackled one of his giants. He didn't die for your sins. He lived for them, spouted the headless terror outside the gates. The pulsating, reanimated corpse was wailing with knowledge. The church bell rang. It had begun. Giants started hurling stones at the temple while the horde climbed the gate. The world became quiet after that. The time will come when your new God will rise. I am not dead. You will all sit at my table, even your precious God, or fall into nothing. He will bow, or I'll eat his young. Closing credits. This has been Candlelit Dinner with a Cadaver, Series 1, Book 1, written by A.J. Patero, narrated by R.E. Harder, copyright 2020 by Anthony Joseph Patero, production copyright by Anthony Joseph Patero. Thank you for listening.